Hi friends, welcome to Unit 7, American Revolution, The Road to Independence. We're on Chapter 1, Part 2 today. Please make sure you have your reader with you. And I want to review Part 1 of Chapter 1. In Part 1, we heard about the French and Indian War, which was a conflict that the British fought with the French for control of land in North America, and Native Americans chose sides. Some fought with the British, and some fought with the French. Ultimately, the British were victorious. That means they were given land from the French, and then the British realized they had a big responsibility. They needed to pay back the money they owed from the war, and they needed money to pay for protecting the colonies. And so they decided to give a stamp act on printed materials where the colonists were required to pay money, buy stamps, when they bought such things as newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, anything made of paper. Now, this was not a gummy, sticky stamp, but rather an impression on paper, and the colonists were not happy. They did not get a choice or even a say in how money was to be raised. The government, the British government, just said, we're going to do this, you're going to pay a tax. And the colonists were not happy. They thought they should have a say. So we're going to read more about the colonists today. We're on page 6 of your reader, so please find that page. Here we go. Every colony had an assembly similar to the Virginia House of Burgesses. The assemblies were not all called the House of Burgesses, but they did the same thing. A group of representatives met to discuss new laws and taxes. Although the colonies continued to raise their own taxes even after 1765, they felt that rather than imposing a new tax on the colonies, the king and his government should have asked these assemblies to find a way to raise money that was needed. Instead, without even as much as a dialogue, a conversation, the king and his government created the Stamp Act. They did not send it to the colonial assemblies, but directly to the Parliament, part of the British government responsible for passing laws and raising taxes. The colonists agreed that there were bills to be paid, and they wanted to contribute, but they also wanted some say in how the money was raised. They were concerned that important decisions about taxes were being made thousands of miles away by a parliament that had no colonial representatives. This process did not seem fair to them. So I'm going to pause for a second. Let's review. Why did the colonists feel the Stamp Act was unfair? Well, the Parliament had no colonial representatives. That means no one in Parliament knew what it was like to live in the colonies. The king and his government decided to put on the new tax. Parliament decided to require the colonists to pay the taxes, which would repay money spent during the French and Indian War. The colonists did not think that was fair because they were not represented in Parliament, and they were not asked for their opinion about how to pay for the war. The colonists wanted a say in the discussion about how the money was raised. It says right here, without even as much dialogue. That means they wanted part of the discussion. The colonists were concerned that important decisions about taxes were made by a government with no colonial representatives. Let's keep going. Other regions outside of England, such as Scotland, had representatives in Parliament. Their jobs was to represent and stand up for the people of Scotland. But there were no representatives from the 13 colonies in Parliament, not even one. When the colonists became upset about the Stamp Act, they expressed their unhappiness in various ways. They held protest meetings. They wrote pamphlets. They sent petitions to London. They tried to explain why they thought the Stamp Act was unfair. Friends, let's look at that last paragraph. The colonists were expressing their unhappiness for the Stamp Act. Did they express that unhappiness in peaceful ways or violent ways? Well, let's take a look at that paragraph. How did they express their unhappiness? They held protest meetings, they wrote pamphlets, and they sent petitions to London. Are those violent acts of protest or peaceful acts of protest? Hopefully you said those are peaceful acts. When we think of violent acts of protest, we think of fighting. Those are not fighting. They're very peaceful acts to protest. All right, this is a picture on page 7 of the British Parliament that made decisions on laws and taxes, including those that affected the colonies. All right, so take a look at that. I see lots of people lined up, sitting up straight in a fancy room, got a big chandelier in the middle, and in the center appears to be someone sitting by themselves. That must be a leader of some sort. I wonder if it's the king? Is the king the leader of Parliament? Or is it the leader of Parliament? And if so, what is that person's name? Let's read on to find out. All right, let's go to page 8. Many colonists were proud British subjects. That means they were proud to be from Great Britain. Just in the same way, if an American citizen moves to another country, they might feel proud to be from America. So, the colonists were proud British subjects. But they also felt that they had rights that the king and his government could not take away. Opposition to the Stamp Act spread. Opposition, you see the word oppose. So people against the Stamp Act. And it started to spread. So that means more and more people were starting to not be happy with the Stamp Act. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses passed a motion protesting the Stamp Act. The Burgesses agreed that the British Parliament had no right to tax the people of Virginia. So now it's not just people, it's a group of people, the House of Burgesses. All right, let's read in the shaded box. Prime Minister Grenville. Looks kind of like an important man. His first name is George. In 1765, the Prime Minister of Great Britain was George Grenville. Now, a Prime Minister is the head of a government with a parliament. So I wonder if this man in the middle is the Prime Minister. Head of the government. This is a picture of Parliament. Could be. We don't know for sure because it's not labeled, but could be. All right, so let's go back to Grenville. He was the mastermind behind the Stamp Act. That means it was his idea. He thought it up. Grenville was faced with the challenge of finding money to support the thousands of British soldiers stationed in the North American colonies. As far as he was concerned, the British soldiers were protecting the colonists, so the colonists should be happy to pay for the soldiers. At first, the British government was surprised by the colonists' response to the Stamp Act. As Prime Minister, Grenville remained unsympathetic to the colonial complaints and protests. However, he did not have widespread support, and other government ministers criticized him. He was replaced as Prime Minister in 1766. Interesting. I find it interesting that the government was surprised that the colonists were not happy. Okay? The soldiers were protecting the colonists. So, shouldn't they be happy to pay for those soldiers? The government was surprised that they weren't. All right? However, Prime Minister Grenville was unsympathetic. Un means not. Not sympathy or no sympathy. He didn't feel bad for them. He was unsympathetic. And friends, I want you to look here. he did not have widespread support. That means the people around him, other leaders, other government leaders, did not agree with his lack of sympathy for the colonists. And it got to a point that he was replaced. All right, let's read about someone who was here in the colonies. All right, I'm on page 9. A leader emerges. George Washington, know that name? Fought in the French and Indian War alongside the British. He served as a major and led a group of militia against the French in the Ohio River Valley. As a result of the successful mission against the French scouting party, Washington was promoted to colonel. He became the commander of a group of soldiers from Virginia and North Carolina. Although his next mission was not as successful, Washington had made a name for himself as a valiant leader. In 1755, he became the commander of all of the Virginia militiamen. He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1758. Friends, let's look at this word emerges. Emerge means to develop or to become into something. So, how did George Washington emerge as a leader? What were the things that happened to him or the things that he did to prove that he was a quality leader? Well, I'm going to find some things he did. And I see the first thing he did is he was a major in an army or group of militia, so a major in the military. And he did such a good job at that he was promoted to colonel, which means he became the commander of a group of soldiers. Okay? And then after he was commander, he did more successful things. He was more successful, so he became the commander of all of the Virginia militiamen. So he went from being a commander of a group of soldiers to being commander of all the militiamen. And then he was elected to the House of Burgesses. So he was a major, which means he was a leader of a group, a small group. Then he was a colonel, so he was a commander of a larger group. Excuse me. And then he became the commander of all of the Virginia militiamen, and he was elected to the House of Burgesses. So he emerged, he developed into a quality leader. All right, before we leave chapter 1 behind, let's answer our big question. Why did the British government tax the colonists, and why did that make the colonists angry? Well, hopefully you remember that the British government had borrowed a lot of money in order to fight in the French and Indian War and to protect the colonists. And it needed to repay that money. So it passed something called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act worked like a tax because people paid it when they bought specific items. In this case, when they bought anything made of paper. This made the colonists very unhappy. All right? And they were unhappy because there was no representation in Parliament, which was 1,000 miles away in Great Britain. And over there, the people of Parliament were making decisions about what people thousands of miles away across the ocean would be doing. And in this case, they would be paying taxes to the Stamp Act. So, have a discussion with your family. Do you think the Stamp Act was fair? Do you think the colonists should have paid their share? Thanks, friends. We'll see you for chapter 2.